is sort of reintroduce myself. So I had been programming since the age of 12, and I was a PhD student studying natural language processing 5 years ago. Yes, 5 years ago. In my spare time, I also really enjoyed programming in a variety of languages. I had other hobbies like martial arts, bicycling, knitting, needle felting. I just had a lot going on in my life. But things have changed. So in 2015, the pain that I was ignoring in my hands built to a level where not only could I not ignore it, I couldn't even actually uncurl my fingers for a long time. Doctors were completely baffled. For about a month, I couldn't do anything but drink vodka through a straw, and I have been in pain now for 5 years, constantly. So now who am I? I couldn't do the same craft hobbies that I did, so I got into comedy, service work, social media overuse, reading obsessively. I couldn't do martial arts or biking, but I needed a contact sport, and that's how I got into roller derby. This is me smashing someone, smashing a jammer off the track. Yeah, I was very cool. This was, yeah. They fell over. Anyway, yes. So now who am I? I couldn't do the same craft hobbies that I used to do. Right, yes. Yeah, so my roller derby name is Gaussian attribution. What about the programming though? So I still couldn't type or write, and this is how I got into voice coding. Just by dictating all my code with Talon, I've managed to resume my PhD. I've written code and papers, including at this conference, the ones that are highlighted. Check them out. I actually really enjoy my work now, when just a few years ago, I couldn't imagine any path forward that didn't involve some kind of miracle cure. When you have a disability, every path forward requires that you ensure that technology serves your needs and not the needs that are imagined by someone else. So that means your tools need to be hackable. And I'm going to use my case as an example. So Talon is a scriptable interface for dictating code. The thing that sets it apart from a standard speech to text system, like the default system for Dragon or the built-in system on a computer, is that it offers an API that programs can customize with their own macros and scripts. So you can set specific commands that only work with a particular app or even a particular file extension. So that means you can have separate keywords for working in a Python file or a C file. And there's a dedicated community who create individual libraries of these commands. And so there are people who make them for Perl or Julia or like for some random app. A lot of basic functionality gets added. So there's macros to repeat previous command, keywords to represent combinations of symbols, custom phonetic alphabets. In a way, this might be a recognizable sort of feeling for people who are real power users of, say, Emacs or Vim. Every user has their own configuration files, and in order to get the most out of a system like that, you really do need to know the scripting or the command language behind it. And in order to learn these commands, I actually added the scripts gradually from the community repository and like put a printout of all of the commands I had on my wall in front of my desk. And also, like, if I'm honest, I'm not just working from my desk, so I also pasted them all around my bed so that I could easily look at them for reference. But like, in spite of how handy this has been for me, there is a problem with this ecosystem. Even though there are a huge number of programmers with like repetitive stress injuries and things like this, the number of platforms that they could choose between is limited, and they often struggle to integrate these systems with proprietary speech recognition systems. So what's the problem? I think there are 3 factors for why the tools disabled people use are not hackable. So there's the drive for profit, there's patronizing attitudes towards disabled people, and there's contempt for accessibility and adaptive technology as a field within our field. Okay, first let's talk about profit. So like many people who dictate to a computer, for years I relied on Dragon. created by Nuance. Dragon is a proprietary piece of software developed that like for Windows and Mac OS, and there weren't really a lot of good speech recognition alternatives at the time, which is why everyone depended on this. Then in 2018, Nuance discontinued support for Dragon on Mac OS. It just wasn't profitable, and that meant an essential service for many disabled people just no longer existed. And because it was proprietary, the software is no longer available. And so Ryan Hyman, who's also the programmer behind Talon, has actually been developing free alternative models that are easier to integrate with using open source tools from Facebook. So then let's talk about another example, not just mine, the diabetic community. So diabetes happens when you don't have a functioning pancreas. So there's this organ that monitors your blood sugar level, changes your insulin level, and like it shouldn't be too high or too low. So then typical diabetic equipment has for a long time included a blood testing meter to check your blood sugar, and then an insulin pump, or if you're less lucky, just like a needle to inject the insulin. So typically a diabetic repeats the same procedure all day. They check their blood, they adjust their insulin level manually according to some heuristic about that glucose level. And then they wait until it's been a while or they notice symptoms of low or high blood sugar, rinse, repeat, right? So the holy grail, if you're a diabetic, would be an artificial pancreas, a system that monitors your blood sugar and has its own internal heuristics that are personalized to your body to inject insulin using some kind of personalized model. So this is the idea behind the closed loop, which is a system developed by diabetics and their carers. So they used standard medical pumps from Medtronic, which were easily adapted because the authentication code was the 6-digit serial number in plain text, and this was publicly known since 2011. So this was fine until Loop started cutting into Medtronic sales, and suddenly this vulnerability was grounds for a recall of the pumps that could be used for a closed loop, even though these DIY systems just use the standard pairing protocol, right? Now, device manufacturers used to claim that they couldn't document their own APIs for systems like this because it would be promoting off-label use, which was prohibited by the FDA. But now the America's FDA has added designations for pumps that allow third-party access. And yet, like Abbott Labs, which is one monitor manufacturer, actually went after a free tool for accessing their own medical data, claiming copyright violation, like let alone actually publishing any kind of APIs, right? So this isn't about security. It's not about regulatory overreach. This is about protecting their profits because they failed to offer products that are as good as what diabetics can create for themselves. Okay, so a little bit now about the patronizing attitudes that disabled people deal with. So our society just doesn't trust disabled people to take care of their own needs or the authorities on their own conditions. And this is a problem that starts like on the most direct level with doctors. So now I'm just gonna rant about doctors. So years ago, the mechanism of my pain was discovered, and it's small fiber neuropathy, means that I'm missing nerves that transmit heat and pain. So I have a sort of phantom limb syndrome going on in my feet and hands. And I got this diagnosis in America through a skin biopsy, which is standard procedure for diagnosing this. It's used throughout America, England, all over the world, but not in Scotland, where I live. So when I saw a neurologist in Scotland, just for the purpose of having my diagnosis in my Scottish medical records, the neurologist wasn't familiar with this test. And so Scotland doesn't actually have a test for small fiber neuropathy. And instead, the neurologist wrote down he suspected significant functional overlay, which is just directly saying that you're delusional. So Next time I saw my GP, he refused to send me to any further doctors, including just a pain management clinic. So instead, he offered to send me to a psychologist who would help me resolve the issues with my mother or whatever that were the true underlying causes of my pain. So then I was ejected from his office for saying the word fuck. Anyway, I eventually found an actual neuropathy specialist in Glasgow. So like that resolved some problems. But it doesn't resolve the fact that we don't have a culture that respects disabled people or trusts them to know their needs. And this is, again, another thing from the diabetic hacker community who pass around nightmare stories about doctors that won't treat them because they aren't using standardized systems. So they have these deliberately non-compliant t-shirts that they can wear. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the contempt that developers and engineers have for accessibility work. So a lot of people just see this as less prestigious than other areas and less interesting. So a lot of this essential work is left to women, as usual. And in fact, a lot of the essential work is left to disabled people themselves. It's like the only reason you could possibly care about this is if you have to use it. Like obviously I'm entirely in favor of disabled people being enabled to fulfill their own needs. And every individual has different needs and we should be able to like build the tools we need, but we shouldn't have to, right? And yet there's this expectation of this. I have a blind friend who's a really skilled systems programmer and was assigned to an accessibility team for years doing work he wasn't interested in, right? And I work on language modeling research, and anyone I meet assumes if they know about my disability that I work in speech recognition. And actually I don't do anything with any practical application. I do like weird interpretability work, right? So there's like a big problem that emerges from the lack of qualified and skilled programmers working in accessibility. And that's that the products are really badly engineered. So insulin pumps often have these vulnerabilities that you could literally use to kill a person just by like passing by and sending a signal to the pump to dump all its insulin in them at once, and they never get fixed. And like essential updates are just never released. So it's like, so in general, here's a message to everyone who's pre-disabled out there, which is consider working in accessibility technology, because we need data scientists to develop better cybernetic medical technology and data engineers who ensure that we can have access to our own data in real time, and better developers in general who are aware of what's required to make a product accessible. But we also, like machine learning wise, we need transparent models so that like the end user understands what's going on and possibly can be included in the loop, and like models that are modular and hackable so that if someone needs to, they can understand what's happening within that model and modify what's happening for their needs, right? And then I have another message, which is for the rapidly degenerating sack of flesh that will soon be disabled for some value of soon. And that is that you shouldn't freak out when this starts to happen. Here's a quote from my favorite illness memoir / nature writing, which is about a person who was completely bedbound and watched a snail for a year. As the snail's world grew more familiar, my own human world became less so. My species was so large, so rushed, and so confusing. I found myself preoccupied with the energy level of my visitors, and I started to observe them in the same detail with which I observed the snail. The random way my friends moved around the room astonished me. It was as if they didn't know what to do with their energy. They were so careless with it. There were spontaneous gestures of their arms, the toss of a head, a sudden bend into a full body stretch, as if there were nothing at all, or they might comb their fingers unnecessarily through their hair. So like people change their behavior when they need to. And eventually you kind of just get used to it and you do what you need to do, even if that means that you do different kinds of gestures. For instance, I've been doing scare quotes like this the whole time. That's how I do scare quotes. I can't really move my fingers enough to do normal scare quotes. So if you're thinking, oh my God, my life is changing in this way, you're probably thinking either, oh, this can't be that hard when you look at what I've had to do to adjust, or you think, oh, I could never do that. I'm like dropping out if that ever happens to me. And those are both wrong thoughts, because it is actually that hard and you can in fact do it. Okay, I have completed my